guys all here, all of you guys in the studio, as well as everybody online. We're so glad that you guys are here. We are in the midst of a series called Summer School, and let me tell you somebody who's getting schooled today. In fact, we want to celebrate alongside of them. That is none other than one of our worship leaders, Matt Light, and his wife, Paige. They're getting schooled in the art of having 3 kids. Matt and Paige welcomed little baby Pierce into the world, and both mom and baby are super healthy and happy, and everyone's sleep deprived. And so, we're going to learn a whole lot. But hey, listen, we are so pumped for today because we are looking forward, towards the beginning of school starting. There's some teachers in the room that are like, it already started. What are you, nuts? Like, we've been at it. But then the rest of us, as we send kids back to school, as we prepare for school, this fall is coming, and there's some things that we have been wanting to talk about as a church community that I believe is important for us, and we've been diving into those topics in this series. And last week I mentioned to you that the building has hit a great milestone. We capped and completed all of the plumbing and got that approved and all that. But this past week, they did one step even further. They buried it all back under concrete. That's been, sealed, all this stuff. It's ready to go. And so we're going to just keep marching forward. And when I think about the building, when I think about this thing that we are together collectively building over on Bee Ridge and McIntosh, I think of one word, and it's not the word church. I think of the word community. Because the building, we have done church in all places, right? We've done church in a field. We've done church early in the morning. We've done church online. We've done church in a school. We have done church in rented and borrowed facilities. We've done church in a storefront. We have done church everywhere. Church is not a building. It's a people. It's a group of people. But a church is a gathering of people, and I think of that space, these 4 walls. We don't own these walls, but this is a place where we gather together and we can have community. Community, I think about that. Church has always been actually a place where we've invited people to pull up a chair. Like from day one, we set out, anybody remember, is your butt still recovering from those hard metal folding chairs, right? Like, we had some elderly people, and none of them are in the room, so you all qualify. You're not elderly yet. But we had some elderly people that were literally like, love your church, but like, I can't sit there, like it's killing me, right? And I get that. But it has always been about community, a place to pull up a chair. See, here's the thing, though, with community. We have a problem with community. As a society, we have a problem with community because there's actually several ways that you can look at community. And if you're taking notes, you can follow along with this. But community, some people look at it like this: a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common. So this is like the community that I live in. It's called Shadow Oaks Estates. Super swanky, right? You put the word estates on the end of it, and you're like, you feel a little prestigious. But so the place that I live, it would be like the equivalent of saying this chair and this chair are at the same table, right? So we live in this place because it's based upon location. But here's the thing. There's people that are in my community that sit in this chair, but they're like this, and then others are like this. Same location, not community. Right? And then we also have another one where we would say that the community is actually a fellowship, right? It's a fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. Here's the way I want you to think about this. I was on a plane this week, and all of the chairs are faced in the same direction, and we're all headed to the same location. Not one person did I get off the plane and go, you know what, we should do this again next week. Same time, same place, same gate, right? Okay, like let's show up and let's all ride on this plane together, breathe the same air, and just have a great time. It's going to be awesome, right? No, you got off and you like elbowed people to get in front, pull your like luggage off the top, and like figure out where you're going. Nobody cares. This is not a community. This is a group of people headed in the same direction simply because you have a shared set of values, of goals. Here's what I want us to think about. Community, for this day, today, I want us to define community as a group of interdependent people intentionally living together for a purpose. This is where the chairs matter, because this chair now faces in. This chair now faces in, and it's centered around the table. Because when you sit here, you're making conversation with the person that sits here. When you sit here, you're saying, can you pass the salt? Can you pass the butter? Can I have a little bit of that? This is the most meaningful form of community that you could possibly have. And this is actually what I believe God's word calls us into. Whether this is representative of a church community, whether this is representative of your business community, whether this is representative of your school community, God calls us to turn our chairs inward towards others. And the word interdependent is important here because this person is dependent and reliant on this person over here. Today I want to show you out of the book of Acts what I believe God has called us to. And so if you have been reading through the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are the four Gospels. And the four Gospels tell the story of Jesus' time here on earth. And as Jesus walked the earth, and it's from four different perspectives. And then we get to the book of Acts. This is kind of like the Gospels part 2. This is where we see the second half of the start of the early church. And we see that the disciples become the apostles, and the apostles begin making disciples, baptizing them and teaching them to obey all that Jesus had commanded, just in the same way that Jesus told them to do in Matthew 28. But at this point in time, the apostle Peter stands up and he addresses this crowd that had gathered around them and tells them that Jesus died on a cross for them, for the forgiveness of their sins, that he was buried in a real tomb, and that 3 days later, he did the unthinkable. He rose from the dead, conquering that so that you and I could have a relationship with God. We can have hope for our future. And verse 41 says that those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. Church planning 101, right? Like, get yourself 3,000 people, and you're going to change the world. And that is exactly what they did. The world was changed. And yet, what do they do? Because you can gather a whole bunch of people. Remember, those planes, I don't even know how many people were on the plane with me. Way too many for my liking. But there's no community there. Like, you can have as many chairs as you want in your house, and it can still not feel like a home. And here's what they did. Verse 42, it says, they devoted themselves, they turned their chairs inward to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. And everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. See, these men and women, the 3,000 people, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship. Fellowship, that gathering together. Fellowship is the Greek word of koinonia, which carries the idea of a close mutual association. That idea that they were interdependent and connected. They pulled up a chair, and it means community. They were all in, right? They pushed their chips in the middle, and they said, we're here. And they revealed something to you and to me in this process, and that is that community is a commitment, not a commodity. Community is not something that you can buy. Like, we don't purchase community. You can buy a ton of chairs. That's not community. You can buy a big property. That's not community. You don't have community because you bought a home. You don't move into community. You commit to community. So think for a second about the difference between a house and a home. You can build a house in a matter of months, right? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, well, anymore, it takes a lot longer. But you get some concrete, some cinder blocks, right? Some 2x4s, and away it goes. And yet, you just have a house. A home is built over time. A home is built when you together put the Christmas tree up in July, together when you are hanging the Christmas lights, and together when you're swimming in the pool, and together when mom falls in the pool, and it's like, oh, you laugh about all this stuff. It gathers you. A home is built over time. You can buy a house, but you build a home. A home matters way more than a house. In fact, I think at the end of our lives, many of us will have lived in some great houses. I really doubt that we'll be like, can I tell you about the granite? Can I tell you that, like, we had the most amazing knockdown ceiling that you've ever seen? Like, it wasn't popcorn ceiling. It was like just this really cool finish. Or like the windows were hurricane glass. I never boarded up. Nobody's going to say that stuff. That will be the very last thing that anyone says. It's going to be, do you remember the time that the kids were riding their scooters in the house and the one threw the thing and it hit the TV and it was like chaos when we were raising kids? You'll talk about, do you remember the time that our house was busting at the seams at Thanksgiving because we just invited everybody that we knew to come join us? We didn't even have enough food. In fact, the turkey didn't even cook, right? That's the moments that you talk about. Because those are the things where you're dependent on one another. You're leaning in. These men and women were devoted to this new community because they knew that it was actually a commitment to one another. What did they do? They shared meals, they prayed together, and they were devoted to growth. But they also did something else. Verse 44, it says, they had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes, and they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. See what they did? They sold stuff. They gave stuff. They met people's needs. They broke bread together. They ate together. They praised God together. And the single thing that ties all of these things together is that they're all verbs, right? They're all action-oriented. These men and women knew something about community that we could learn, and that is that community is active. Community is not something that happens to us. Like, you need to hear me say that. Community doesn't happen to us. Community happens because of us. It's interdependent. There's an intentionality behind what these people did, what these men and women did. And they were active with one another. Like high school students, middle school students, this is a part of what you do. You can't just be like sitting there on the wall and be like, well, nobody ever wants to be my friend. Nobody came over and talked to me. Like, we can make those excuses. And before we, like, rag on high school students, how many adults do you know that they're like, yeah, so, like, I went to church and nobody said hi. Well, what time did you get there? 5 minutes after it started. Cool. Did anybody ignore you? No, I just went and sat down. Okay. Like, community is active. It requires you moving towards people. And guess what? Like, we're going to move towards you too, but that's that interdependent. The chairs are turned into one another. Like, we show up in each other's lives. And the question I have is, how intentional are you in your community? And in whatever community that this represents, how intentional are you? You know, here at Hope City, recently I heard a story about our sourdough starter class, one of our summer socials, right? So here's the ladies showing up at sourdough. I don't know why it was all women either. I'm just kind of confused. Like, it didn't say on the list, hey, men, you can't come. But nobody else was there. But they were like learning how to make sourdough bread and anything else that comes from sourdough starter, which is magnificent. I'm the recipient of a lot of this. But it was a great night where they were all like hanging out, and some of them were like, I will never do that in my life, right? Like, let's be real, right? I'll never do this again. Or how about this one? The last weekend, we did our Day for Hope outreach at Brentwood Elementary School. And here's what I loved. I loved watching Patty Johnson serve families, giving them book bags. And there were students all in this room. Our Hope City youth showed up in full force, and they were helping hand out things and getting them into the hands of people. We had, some of you, as liaisons, walking families around and helping them get what they needed for school this year. And we do this at Hope City because we are a community that believes that God has called us to a community. And so we want to be an active community that is just, it doesn't just exist for you and for me. We exist for the good of others. And I hope you know that we're here for you. But we face an interesting crossroads in our world. Like for hundreds of years, you attended church because it was the one that was in your community. It was your parish, right? Like there was a parish mentality. And yet now COVID destroyed all of that because you can attend any church that you want in the world online. You can listen to anybody. You can hear the best preaching. You can hear the best worship. And yet, we can miss out on the interdependent connectivity that we have with one another. Like, you can go home and stream Furtick after this, or Andy Stanley, or Craig Rochelle, or my buddy Josh Surratt, like anybody you want. But we need one another. We need one another. We've got to have our chairs turned in to each other. And see, what I'm all for church online, but what I'm not for is bouncing from church to church, running from community, or being afraid of community. We have to stop treating church like a commodity and see it as a commitment. See, I'm not really sure if you look at it this way, but we have a responsibility to one another. That it's not just a show up and let me see what I get from church. It's actually, what am I bringing to this community today? Because I watch you guys when you show up, and I'm so proud of you because you are an incredible group of people that you see when somebody else is coming that may be a little nervous or they're not really, haven't been to church in a while, which is like, this is a great place to be. We're not going to guilt you for that. And you all move towards people. You welcome people. Like you invite them closer. You bring them in. You help turn chairs towards one another. You have a responsibility to the community around you. And that's every age. That's high school, middle school, adults, seniors, everyone. So what are you waiting for? Don't let life go by. Remember that community is interdependent people intentionally living together for a purpose. And here's what happened in the book of Acts. When they started doing that, in Acts 2:47, it says, the Lord added to their number daily those that were being saved. Their growth was exponential. Like it was just up and to the right because these people, they knew that when they cared for one another in this community, that what it was absolutely mind-blowing. It was unbelievable what was happening because community is contagious. It's a lot like laughter, right? Community it's contagious. Have you ever been in remember when you were a kid and, somebody else was giggling and it was the total wrong time, right? And then you just started giggling too. And then what happened is your mom gave you this is what I call it, the I dare you glare. They're like, I dare you. I dare you to keep giggling, right? You better knock it off right now. That look, my mom was she was the organist and the piano player at our church, and she did that for years, selflessly, serving our church. And when I was a real little kid, I love our little kids here at Hope City because I can remember being a little kid and how hard it is to be in church and be patient and all this stuff. And I can remember my mom it got a little bit louder and she kind of leaned over a little bit when I was acting a fool, and because those were back in the days when the pastor sat in the thrones on the stage, and so I was like a kid just by myself and acting up and all this kind of stuff. And community is contagious. Giggling is contagious. God put us in community in the way that he's in community with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He modeled community for you and for me. And if we're not careful, there's things that will get in the way of us actually living out community. I think we all can identify now that we want community, and it's important, but there is actually some things that prevent us from experiencing that. Sometimes we're afraid of what people will think of us. Sometimes we're just too nervous that something that we've done in our past will show up and will prevent us from being a part of community in the future. And sometimes we're just unwilling to get out of our comfort zones. We're just tired of trying. Maybe you've tried. Maybe you've been to a bunch of different churches, or you've been in a bunch of different jobs, and you're like, this is not working. I want you to hear what I think our spiritual enemy, Satan, does in order to prevent us from having community. Because he's super intentional. God, through Jesus, moves us towards people and towards him. There's always an invitation to come closer. That's what the gospel does, is it invites us in. It brings us closer. But your spiritual enemy and mine, Satan, all he wants to do is divide, to separate, to push you further away. In this story where Jesus interacts with this man, I actually want you to look at this in the book of Luke, where there's this guy, he's demon-possessed. In fact, in verse 27, Jesus steps ashore. He was met by a demon-possessed man from the town. And for a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but he lived in the tombs. So this guy is out of his mind. Like he is not clearly thinking. He is running around naked and not living in a house, and he's on the outskirts of society. He had the very presence of evil in his life. You need to know that. And it's the same thing that when Satan longed to be God and to be the same as God, he was cast out of heaven with all of the many angels who also rebelled against God. And it's been his goal from the beginning to separate, to divide. And so far in this story, it looks like evil is winning. But in verse 28 it says that when he saw Jesus, this man, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me?" Right? Like, Son of God, Son of the Most High God, I beg you, don't torture me. Like, this is what he's saying. For Jesus had commanded the impure spirit to come out of the man. And many times it had seized him, and though he was chained hand and foot and kept under guard, he had broken his chains and had been driven by the demon into solitary places. This guy was separated from all of community. Community was actually trying to help him, and yet what was going on in his life was pulling him away. And maybe you don't have a whole mob of demons controlling your life, but you might have a mob of thoughts that are actually trying to take over your life. And it's preventing you from being in community with God and with others. You have your own inner demons, right? We would say it that way. But remember that Satan's job, his goal, isn't just to get you to worship Satan. It's actually just to destroy what is rightly God's, what is the Lord's, and he'll use anything to make that happen. In fact, today I want to give you 3 things that I think he uses to isolate you from community. And the very first one is fear. I believe that fear gets a hold of us, deep inside of us. And you're afraid, like, well, if they know my deepest, darkest secrets, they will not want anything to do with me. If they know, if they were to find out, and it actually just prevents you from kind of turning your chair just a little bit more, maybe a couple more degrees, and then depending upon what, that is that you don't want them to find out, it might even cause you to totally change your perspective, change your position. Maybe the second thing I think he uses is the word failure. And this is when Satan reminds you of, hey, do you remember when you started that business and everybody saw it crash and burn? Nobody will want you in their community, right? Or you remember when you tried that dating relationship and it just didn't work out? Yeah, you're a failure. Or you know what? Remember that friendship? It backfired? Yeah, you feel like you're no good and you're nothing. And failure prevents you from engaging with others. Because it didn't work this time, it means it won't work next time. And then I think there's one more thing, one more F word, and that is fatigue. Some of us are just flat out tired. And we look at things and when we get tired, our mind starts making things up if we're not careful, right? Be careful with fatigue. I'm telling you, hear me again. Be careful when you are tired. Because when you're tired, you are tempted to say and do things that you would never do when you are fully rested. Anybody ever had a snacksident? Right? Like, that's when it's like, late and you're just like, I am hungry, right? and you go into the pantry and you just end up eating the entire thing of Oreos, right? That's a snacksident. You had a little snacksident, and you can just take that to the bank. You know what? I ate the entire bag of Doritos. I was tired, right? I just ate. I wasn't even hungry. I was just tired. Fatigue can do this to you. Fatigue can cause you to do way more devastating things than a simple snacksident. See, fatigue can cause you to question, is it even worth it? Is it even worth it for me to continue to lean in my marriage? Is it even worth it for me to continue to be the best employee that I possibly can be? Is it even worth it for me to engage with my neighbors? You know, like when you pull into your driveway at the end of the day, and it's been a long day, and you get out of your car, you're just tired. Do I engage with those that are outside? Do I like, hey, you know, like, what does community look like? Fatigue says, don't bother. You don't need to. Satan wants to get in your head and say, look what you've done. Here's this man, he's living naked, living on the edges of community, lost his family, his friends. Everybody's given up for him. Chains can't hold him down. And it'd be so easy to say, look at what you've done. But that's kind of like the way that we live. We go, look at what I've done. Nobody wants to know me. I'm not good enough. I've got no friends. And I can never connect with anybody else here because they're not like me. And then Jesus steps in and changes this guy's world. Jesus asked him, what is your name? I just want you to hear that. The first thing Jesus says is, what's your name? He saw him as a person. He saw him as a man that had value. That a man that maybe had lost his way, but had dignity. There was something in him. And he responded with legion because many demons had gone into him. And they begged Jesus repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss. A large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and the demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs, and he gave them permission. And when the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. Now, this is an incredible passage of Scripture, and it's an incredible display of power on the part of Jesus, because Jesus sends something that is unclean into something that is unclean. You know, in the Jewish world, in the Jewish culture, pigs were considered an unclean animal that they could not eat, that it was kind of a detestable animal. And he took what was unclean, put it into the unclean, and then sent it off into the abyss, into the lake, into, you know, this dynamic that they didn't understand. The Near Eastern mindset would see that as the place that chaos lived and reigned. And Jesus sends it directly where it came from. But I love that Jesus steps in and he doesn't say, hey, like, tell me all about what got you here. No. He doesn't say, man, you're such a failure, but don't worry, Jesus is here. Your Savior's here. No, he leans in and he says, what's your name? Because failure is just an event. It's never a person. It's something that happens, but it's never, ever a person. And Jesus sees beyond the past. He sees into the future. People are God's priority. You are God's priority. Satan would love nothing more than to convince you that God just doesn't love you anymore, or that God doesn't care about you any longer. And yet what he's inviting us to is to turn in and to be interdependent and connected with one another. In verse 34, it says, when the people saw that what had happened, they ran off and reported this to the town and countryside. The people went out to see what had happened. They came to Jesus, and they found the man with whom the demons had gone out sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. But those who had seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured. And then all the people of the region of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them because they were so overcome with fear. So he got into the boat and left. They were so terrified, not because of the loss of livestock, but because of this man who everyone knew as being an outcast. Everyone knew as being like this pariah. And yet Jesus healed him and brought him back in. And they were scared because of what Jesus had done. But what could happen next? See, this is the power of life change. This is a power when your life is changed by Jesus. In verse 38 it says that the man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, return home and tell how much God has done for you. So the man went away and told everybody all over the town what Jesus had done. This guy wanted to follow Jesus. He was like, I just want to be wherever you are. Like, I'm going to bring my seat where you go. I'm going to just follow you, Jesus. And he goes, no. Go to another community and turn your chair in and start telling them about this community. Tell them about me. Tell them what I've done for you. Tell them about how I've changed your world multiple times. See, God calls you into community to impact a community. This is never meant, it's never one-sided. We are meant to be in a community, to impact a community. And following Jesus calls us into the world, not out of it. See, the gospel was never intended to segregate us, but to fully integrate us, to bring us amongst one another, to lean into our neighborhoods, to lean into our workplaces, to lean into our church community, to lean into your high school, to lean into all of those places that you find yourself interacting with other human beings. Because they need to know about the goodness of God and what he's done in your life. They need to hear you talk about how, like, you know, when I was young, before I knew the Lord, like, my life was going in a whole separate direction. But because of God, my life got turned around, and he healed my marriage. He healed my anger issues. He healed, whatever it might be in your life. Let me tell you about the goodness of God. And just watch as community changes, as people begin to turn their chairs in and listen a little bit more. And the thing that I kind of, wonder about is just who's at your table? Like, who is literally sitting at the seats across from your table? And most importantly, this week, who can you invite to pull up a chair? Who is on the edges of your community or the edges of those places that you find yourself that you can say, hey, you know what? I just want to invite you. I want to invite you to just pull up a chair and learn more about them. Lean in and invest in them and in their life. Because this is why we say it all the time, that we're for Sarasota. Because we believe that God is for Sarasota. And too often people know what we stand against. Like, we don't do that. No. See, here's what we do at Hope City is we want people to know what we are for. That we're for our city. We're for our friends. We're for our neighbors. We are for our community that God has called us to. We're a community that impacts a community. So who can you invite to your table? Who can sit in your chair? Who can be welcomed into your home? And what would it look like to intentionally invest in people this week?